There's an ongoing universal principle that is at work everywhere, all the time, inside and outside the church, in Hollywood, in Washington, D.C., on Main Street, on Wall Street, in locker rooms, and in boardrooms across the world. It's that God will humble the proud and he'll lift up the humble. He'll humble the proud and he'll lift up the humble. Many times we see this dramatically in people's lives in this life, and sometimes it's not until the next life. But praise God, according to the Bible, we don't have to wait to be humbled. We can humble ourselves. Peter and James both exhorted us. They were humbled the hard way, and they said, I exhort you to humble yourself under the mighty hand of God, and he will lift you up in due time. I love those words, humble yourself. It means we don't have to wait. We don't have to wait to be humbled. We've been looking at Nebuchadnezzar, right? If you've been here the last several weeks, he was the king of Babylon. Babylon it existed in the territory of modern-day Iraq. Okay? Babylon. God has been speaking to Nebuchadnezzar that his power, the power that he had been given, they were the world ruling empire at the time of Daniel. And God was showing him, your power, your authority, the position I've given it all to you. You're in power the way that you're in power because I've raised you up. Really? A pagan king in Babylon? Yes. You know that God's bigger than what's happening in church? And I love what happens in church. But he's working. He's working in people's lives, in places that you're not. God's working. God's there. It's clearly stated in Romans 13:1 that all governing powers, all governing authorities are what they are because God has made them. Romans 13:1. Nebuchadnezzar was stronger than everybody else, and he knew it. And so what did he do? He arrogantly has been taking credit for all that he achieved, right? And we've seen in these chapters, these last few chapters, God moving decisively to humble Nebuchadnezzar, and he was reduced. We saw last week, he was reduced to an animal-like state, living out in the fields, eating straw like an ox, totally lost his mind for 7 years. Went crazy, homeless. And when he finally lifted his eyes, this is where we left off in chapter 4, he lifted his eyes to heaven. He turned from himself, this narcissistic, it's all about me. And he finally, after being literally insane for 7 years, he lifted his eyes to heaven. And his senses came back to him when he finally genuinely acknowledged that God is the ruler over all, forever. That God is the one who raises up kings and deposes kings. When he came to worship, in his words, the King of heaven, the true and living God, the God of Daniel, he was restored to his right mind. Nebuchadnezzar took the hard road. He took the hard road. But he finally came to truly humble himself before God and worship him. And God, you know what God did? He restored him to his throne. He restored all of his glory back to him. Now, a few decades later, this is where we come to chapter 5 now. It's a few decades later, a guy named Nabonidus, He's the last king of Babylon. He's likely already captured by the Medo-Persians. Okay, after the Babylonian Empire, and we saw this in Nebuchadnezzar's dream of this statue at the head of gold. Daniel said, "That's you, Nebuchadnezzar, but after you is coming another empire." And it signified it. We saw the details of it, the Medo-Persian Empire. And we look back in history on what Daniel looked forward prophetically in the Medo-Persian Empire. They had likely already captured this last king, Nabonidus, who was the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. Okay? They already captured him. There was a siege at this point. When we come to chapter 5, the Medes and the Persians now had set a siege around Babylon. We're hearing about sieges right now. Some of these exact same players. Isn't this bizarre? His son, Nabonidus' son, his name is Belshazzar. Okay, now don't confuse this with the Babylonian name that they've given to Daniel, which is Belteshazzar. Okay, this guy's name is Belshazzar. I mean, if you're Babylonian here, you probably are like, yeah, it's a totally different name, but for us American folks, it sounds like the same name. This Belshazzar, the king, made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords, and he drank wine in the presence of the thousands. So Belshazzar, and we'll talk about who this guy is in a second, he's not afraid of this siege that's surrounding the city of Babylon. Okay, he's confident. He's super confident in Babylon's impressive defense system and their vast supplies. While the city is under siege by the Medes and the Persians, he's throwing this huge drinking party. He's been drinking. Okay? You combine arrogance, carelessness with intoxication, it always ends bad. It always ends bad. Okay? He's so confident that there's no way these Medes and Persians could harm us. We are the mighty Babylon, and it was a glorious city, Babylon. I think we have a artist's rendition. Conservative calculations set the dimension of ancient Babylon like this. Outer walls you can't even see the outer walls in this picture, 17 miles long. These walls here that you see, 22 feet thick, 90 feet high. The outer walls had guard towers that rose up another 100 feet high. City gates made of bronze, a system of inner and outer walls and moats gave this sense of total security. But you throw in a drinking party at this moment that they're totally letting their guard down. They're totally letting their guard down. They're totally letting their guard down. And they're getting drunk. There's an arrogance. They're not being watchful. Arrogance and intoxication equals disaster. And while he tasted the wine, he's got this huge party with all these officials. Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father, notice it says father Nebuchadnezzar. In these ancient cultures, when you say father, it doesn't necessarily mean like the guy's dad. It could be his grandfather. This is the way that it was understood. But during this drinking party, he gives this command, bring in the gold and the silver vessels, which in this case would be his grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar, had taken from the temple, which had been in Jerusalem. The temple was destroyed by this time. The people of Judah are in Babylonian captivity. We saw this as we studied all the prophets leading up to Daniel, as we studied Ezekiel, we studied Isaiah. Jerusalem was destroyed. The people were scattered. So he gives this command, bring in all those silver vessels and the gold vessels that my grandpa, my father, seized from Jerusalem, from the temple, when we destroyed the city and wiped out the temple. Just like they carried away all the gifted, really good-looking, brightest young people among them, one of which is Daniel. Because they're going to use him, they're going to train him for the benefit of the Babylonian kingdom. Well, they took all the gold and the silver vessels from the worship of God. And now here, Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, Belshazzar, that we're introduced to here, well, his dad, Nabonidus, who is the last king here, is captured, or he's away. We don't know where his dad is. But he's in there while his dad's gone. The dad he's actually the king. He's throwing a party, like some of you have done before when your parents took off. You threw a big party in their house, kind of broke the place up, invited your friends, tried to clean it up before your parents got home. But here, they brought the gold vessels. So he gives this command, bring these vessels in. We're going to drink out of those vessels from Jerusalem's temple, that we took from the house of God. And the kings and his lords, verse 3, at the end of verse 3, and his wives, his concubines, they were drinking out of these vessels. Total disrespect, total sacrilege, total blasphemy against God, total disregard, in ignorance, perhaps. See, God had instructed through Moses that the children of Israel make these vessels, and they were fashioned for the worship at the tabernacle in the wilderness. These vessels, as we saw in the book of Exodus, the whole temple complex was a portable, interactive model, prophetic model of the gospel that was in the middle of the life of the Israelites for centuries. The tabernacle, we saw it in the book of Exodus. So every detail. It was a portable, interactive, prophetic model of the gospel. And these vessels were part of this whole picture, which Christ fulfilled when he came. And he gave himself as a sacrifice for our sins. And he's taken away our sins 100% forever. But here Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, at this huge drinking party, they drank the wine from these vessels that were set aside, sanctified, holy, which means they're set aside for the purposes of worship at the tabernacle that's in the temple that's been destroyed. And they praised the God. So here these Babylonian pagans are in the palace in Babylon, right before Babylon is completely decimated and falls, before the Medes and the Persians take over, and they're drinking now out of these vessels, using what is holy for common use. That's why I said sacrilege. And they praised, while they drank, they toasted and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron and wood and stone. So they add injury to insult. They add blasphemy to their sacrilege. They use these vessels taken from God's temple to worship gold and silver, bronze, and these things, full idolatry. This is what you call taking the Lord's name in vain. This guy is foolish on so many levels. He's let his guard down with the enemy surrounding the city. He's drunk, which always leads to regret. And now he's blaspheming the God of heaven. It's interesting that there's been ruins that have been uncovered in Babylon, in Iraq, and a large court has been found, 56 by 170 feet, decorated with Greek columns. It's probably where this feast took place. This was probably the banquet hall at this palace in Babylon. And so while they're letting their guard down, getting drunk, blaspheming God with the enemy surrounding them, in the same hour, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, and the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Now this is where we get the proverbial phrase in our culture. When someone's demise is imminent, we say, dude, the writing is on the wall. This is where it comes from. Daniel chapter 5. You know, you're looking at some guy and it's like you just see his life is just getting ready to, he's going to lose his job. Something bad's coming down the pike. Dude, the writing's on the wall. It's so clear what you're about to experience. Okay? Now I find it interesting. You can hold off on the video for a second. I'm going to show you a little 5-second video clip, but it's interesting to me that the hand of God is writing on the wall in a Babylonian palace. What? God himself is speaking to a pagan king who worships all these crazy idols, total pagan, total idolatry. He's talking to someone that you would think has no exposure to God. Someone ever asked you, what about the person who never heard about, what about the guy out in the jungle somewhere in the Amazon, that never heard? How do you know? God's working in ways that are way beyond what he's doing through your life and through my life. God's way bigger than us. He's doing more in more places, and he's more merciful than we think, not less merciful. He's doing more than we realize. Whatever you see that God's doing, he's doing way more than you see that he's doing. Okay, you could get reports of everything that we know. The underground church right now in Iran, which is the biggest Christian movement on planet Earth right now, is the underground church in Iran. And women are leading this movement. It's the biggest Christian movement on the planet right now. Did you even know that? What he's doing right now in China. South Korea. South Korea has the biggest churches in the world. What he's doing down in Brazil. Brazil they're sending missionaries all over the world with the gospel. We could line up everything we know that God is doing, and you know what? He's doing more. He's doing more, not less than we know, among more people than you realize. You hold up here. I'm going to show a clip of a guy. I think he's was Syrian with ISIS, an ISIS fighter. You can check out the full interview. This guy's a pastor now. But God was speaking to him in his world. He came to faith in Christ. But check this out.
A moment I felt a touch on my left shoulder and a voice that says, I forgive you. And he didn't understand. I did not understand how could that be possible? Because I have heard Allah is forgiving and merciful, but we cannot know His forgiveness till the day of judgment. So I said, who are you that forgives me? And I feel forgiven today. And he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. I did not understand what that means because I had never heard those words. So I said, what is your name? And he said, Jesus Christ, the living God. I fell on the floor. I just wept.
So there you go. Yeah. God is working among more people than we realize. And he's more merciful than anybody in this room or all of us combined. I was watching that, and I looked up, and you can see that he pastors a church, and it's amazing. The people, the last person that you would think that God could reach, someone from one of these groups that had brutalized, and God reached him. But here, God is in the palace in Babylon, in Iraq, speaking, writing on the wall, communicating to a pagan king. And then the king's countenance changed. Okay, he had just been lifting up the wine. He's totally buzzed, partying hard, right? Carefree. Oh, praising the God of silver and gold and all this, and all of a sudden there's a hand writing on the wall. And his countenance changed, his face fell, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his hips were loosed and his knees knocked together. In other words, he became totally terrified, is what is being described here. He was shaking. Have you ever been shaking because of nerves? He's shaking in his boots. His thoughts are troubling him. And the king cried aloud. This guy cries out now. Bring in my astrologers and the Chaldeans and the soothsayers. The king spoke, saying to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now it's interesting, archaeologists have discovered why Belshazzar here offered the interpreter of his dream the third place. It's because the real king at this moment is Nabondias, and this is his son Belshazzar, who is second in the kingdom. And so this is why he's offering him third, not second place, because he's in second place. So he's like, if you can find somebody, one of my wise men, to tell me what this writing means, I'm going to reward him. And one of the rewards is I'm going to make him third in power in the kingdom. He's not so much interested in the dictionary definition of the words that have been inscribed on the wall, but to whom this message is directed and its significance. And now all the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation. We don't know why these guys can't tell him what it says. Maybe they're afraid to tell him because they know what it says. We saw that in the last chapter. The guys, it was clear what the dream was about that Nebuchadnezzar had, his second dream that we saw in the last chapter, but the guys didn't want to tell him because he was a hothead tyrant and they were afraid for their lives. Some have speculated that the writing might have been in Hebrew, and these wise men simply didn't know how to read Hebrew. We don't know why these guys couldn't tell him what it says, what the hand wrote on the wall. But it says in verse 9, then King Belshazzar was greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed, and his lords were astonished. Everyone's looking at him. He's like, the party's over now. He's not dancing anymore and holding up the cup. He's terrified, totally terrified. Now, if he couldn't understand the writing, why would it trouble him so much? He doesn't know what it says. He doesn't know who the message is to. Why is he so terrified? Because his conscience is firing off right now, and he's like, his conscience is telling him, this is to you, and it's really bad news. He doesn't even know what it is. You ever dealt with a bad conscience? Where every little thing you're like, oh no. You're interpreting all these little things happening, and it's horrible to be plagued with a bad conscience. And then the queen, notice, because of the words of the king and his lords, she came into the banquet hall. So the word's going out. Nobody can figure out what this message is that was written by this mysterious hand on the wall, the queen or the queen mother. Now it's hard to identify who this is. Probably Belshazzar's mother, who would be the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. But she spoke and she said, "O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance change." She's a mother who's very encouraging. And she says, there's a man in your kingdom in whom is the Spirit of the holy God. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in this man. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief over the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers, inasmuch as an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting of dreams, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel. Notice she uses Daniel's Hebrew name, which signifies that she had a respect for him. Everybody's been calling him Belteshazzar, which means lady, servant of the king. Because he'd probably been castrated, which I don't like to think about. It's funny, a lot of Bible commentators don't even want to admit that that's probably what happened to him. They castrated him. The one who was over him in the program he was in was the chief of the eunuchs, which was a custom in these ancient cultures. When anybody's anywhere near the king's women and in his court, it wasn't like in America. Then they started calling him lady. That would be hard. This is some of the stuff Daniel put up with. But the queen here now, she's saying there's this guy, this Daniel. And here, Belshazzar doesn't even know about him. Okay, this is because time has gone on. There's this Daniel whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give you the interpretation. Notice. And then Daniel was brought in before the king, and the king spoke and said to Daniel, "Are you that Daniel? Are you the Daniel that the queen mother told me about? You were one of the captives among the people of Judah back in the day, decades ago, when we brought you all into exile, whom my father the king brought from Judah. I've heard of you." Because his mom just told him about Daniel. "I've heard about you, that the Spirit of God is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not give the interpretation. I asked my wise men to tell me what this means. They couldn't do it. And I've heard about you, that you can give interpretation, explain enigmas. Now if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you will be clothed with purple, with the royal colors. You'll have a chain of gold around your neck, and you shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." These guys used material things and positions. This is the way the world works. Material things and positions to motivate people. And Daniel answered and said before the king, "You can keep all the gifts to yourself. I'm not for hire. I don't do what I do for money or material things. You can give the rewards to someone else. Give them to someone else that might be in need." This is Daniel's response. And yet I will read the writing to the king, and I will make known to him the interpretation. O king, so he begins to tell him, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar, your father, which would be his grandfather, a kingdom. This is the Babylonian Empire. Daniel's speaking now before this grandson. The Most High God gave your grandfather his authority over this world-ruling empire. He gave him majesty and glory and honor. Everything that he had and now you've inherited was all given by God. You are of this royal family, Daniel's saying to this Belshazzar character. All your majesty, that beautiful robe and all of the luxuries you have, it's only because God's allowed this. And because of the majesty that God gave your grandfather, all the people, the nations, languages trembled and feared before him. The whole world feared him. Whoever he wished, he executed. Whoever he wished, he kept alive. Whoever he wished, he set up. Whoever he wished, he put down. Your grandfather had the power to prolong or end lives. He had the power to promote people or to hold them back, get them fired. And all that authority was given him by God. By God. But when his heart was lifted up, he became self-impressed. He's like, look at me, I'm all the rage. And his spirit was hardened in pride. He was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. So Daniel here, before he reads the writing on the wall to this king, this grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, he feels compelled to review the history behind the power of the throne of the Babylonian Empire. He runs through everything that we saw last time with Nebuchadnezzar, how God humbled him. That's what we saw in the last chapter. And he tells him, he says, then your grandfather was driven from the sons of men. His heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys, and they fed him with grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven. He lived outside. And we saw last week it was for 7 years, until he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men, and he appoints over it whomever he chooses. Now this was what God had revealed to Nebuchadnezzar in his dream, that his kingdom would be for a limited time. And then after him would come another empire, the Medes and the Persians, and after them would come another empire, the Greek Empire, and then the Roman Empire. And we went through that whole thing. But Nebuchadnezzar had been wondering, what will be after me? And God gave him this dream of this huge statue. And his response was to build an all-gold statue. Remember that? He rebelled against what God revealed to him. Because Daniel had said, you're the head of gold, but your kingdom is temporary. Your power is temporary. You know that everything we have here is temporary? It's a stewardship. Your body's temporary. It's falling apart right now. You know? Take care of it, but don't get too into it, because this isn't everything. It's going to go. All the money you have, one day you're going to have to hand it all over. So use it wisely. Invest in eternity if you're wise. Some of you have given power and you have authority over other people. Not to abuse them. God doesn't give power to abuse people. And a lot of people are doing that. And they're going to be brought down. They're going to contend with God. And your power, your position, your titles, they're all going to be stripped from you. And people have a hard time letting go. I have a hard time. God's done some cool stuff through my life, and I've had to let go of stuff over and over again, because that thing isn't mine. The ministry in Hungary is not mine. God did it through us, and it's his thing. And then he said, now it's time for you to get out of the way. And it was hard. I went through a season of depression. Who am I? Because my identity was in it. I wanted to hold on to it. This is amazing. And God was like going, it's never been yours. Everything's temporary. Let it go. It's not about you. It's not about me. This was the message to Nebuchadnezzar. You've been given what you've been given, this power, and God's been using you to bring judgment on nations, to spank his chosen. But you need to let it go, bro. It's not about you and your ego. Be thankful that God raised you up and he gave you all this glory and honor and purpose in your life. But have an open hand with God. If he wants to hand it to someone else to run the next leg of the relay, let him run it. And just be blessed. But he built this all gold statue and he demanded everybody worship it. It's in total defiance against what God told him in the dream. That you're just temporary. It's not about you. He said, no, it is about me. And I'm going to be this forever. And God's like going, no, you're not. You're going to go insane. You're going to go insane holding on. It's going to make you crazy. And he became crazy until he lifted his eyes to heaven. And he realized it's not about me, it's about you, God. And he began to worship and said, you are the one who's permanent. You're the one whose kingdom and power endures forever, not mine. And he bowed his heart. He humbled his heart before the King of heaven, before the God, the creator of the universe. And then God gave him his sanity back and gave him his authority back. And he worshiped the Lord from that day on. A pagan king. And so here Daniel's telling Belshazzar the history, his family history. He's telling him, this is your family history. But you, his son, Belshazzar, you have not humbled your heart. Although you knew all of this. You knew all this. You have less excuse than your grandfather. You knew of all that God dealt with him. You know this story that I just recalled to you. And knowing all that, having all that background, you have lifted yourself up. There's a problem. You've lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven, and they've brought the vessels of the house, of God's house before you, and your lords and your wives and concubines, and you've been drinking, getting drunk with the vessels of the house of God. And you've praised the gods of silver and gold and bronze and iron, wood and stones, which do not see or hear or know. You've said God. You've taken what is God's and you've used it for nothing, vanity. And the God who holds your breath in his hands and owns all of your ways, you've not glorified. Wow. Whoa. The God who holds your breath, Belshazzar, in his hands and he owns all your ways. You've not glorified him. And then the fingers of the hand were sent from him, and this writing was written. And this is the inscription that was written. Mene, tekel, upharsin. Okay, there you got it. This is the interpretation of each word, Daniel says. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom. It's limited. Your days are numbered. And finished it. Tekel, you've been weighed in the balances and you've been found wanting. Something's missing. Pheres, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians, the ones that are surrounding the city out there that you think you're invincible against. God is handing now the kingdom of Babylon. This is a huge moment in world history that you can find in archaeology. When the Babylonian kingdom was brought down and then the Medes and the Persians rose to power. Adam Clarke says it should be observed that each word here stands for a short sentence. Mene signifying numeration, tekel a weighing, and peres a dividing. God had Belshazzar's number and it fell short. God had weighed Belshazzar and it came up missing. Something was missing. And God will divide Belshazzar's kingdom to the Medes and Persians. Your kingdom has been divided. There's a commentator named Moitier, and actually this is from his commentary in Isaiah. He said in October 539 BC, Cyrus advanced into lower Mesopotamia, leaving Babylon till last, conquered and occupied the surrounding territory. Seeing which way the wind was blowing, Nabondias, which is this Belshazzar's dad, who we don't know where he is, he deserted the city, leaving it in charge of his son Belshazzar. The taking of Babylon was bloodless and effortless, as Daniel 5 here implies. It's just going to be given over to them. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus relates that the Persian king Cyrus, of the Medes and the Persians, conquered Babylon by diverting the flow of the Euphrates River into a nearby swamp, this lowering the level of the river so his troops could march through the water and right under the river gates. They would still not have been able to enter had not the bronze gates of the inner walls been left inexplicably unlocked, said the historian. This was exactly what God had predicted in Isaiah 44. You can read that. We studied that months and months ago, or Jeremiah 51, where it says that God opened the gates of the city of Babylon for Cyrus. 200 years before it happened, God described what would happen, and it happened as the historian looks back on and says that's how it happened. And then Belshazzar gave the command. Okay, this is a pretty negative report that Daniel has just given. This is, he interpreted what was written. And Belshazzar gave the command, and they clothed Daniel with purple, even though Daniel said, I don't need your clothes or your gold chains. I don't need third in the kingdom, any of this. But he's put this stuff on him, and he made a proclamation concerning him that he should be third ruler of the kingdom. And that very night, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. And so now the next kingdom comes into play. Darius of the Medes and the Persians, 62 years old. I don't like that number. That's how old I am. And then I was looking at that going, what's the meaning of this, God? And the Lord's like, there's no meaning here. It means that this dude was 62 when the next kingdom came into play. And so there we have another lesson in how God will humble the proud, but give grace to the humble. God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourself, therefore. This doesn't just apply to kings or rock stars or Hollywood stars or politicians. It does apply to them. There's people going through a lot of stuff, taking a lot of drugs because of pride and ego. We can humble ourselves before God. There's a lot of abuse that's happening in homes all throughout the Inland Empire. Terrible abuse. Because people see themselves as more than they are. They see other people as less than they really are. There's a problem here. This is on our level. We need to humble ourselves every day before the Lord. And as we do, he will lift us up. He'll bless us and fill us so we can be a blessing to others. It's not about you. It's not about your kingdom. It's not your kingdom's. There's no kingdom of Greg. Pastor Ed always says his kingdom's really small. It's like this little circle around his feet. It's not about me. It's not about you. It's about the King of heaven. Glorifying the King of heaven. Saying, God, it's all about you. Use me. Whatever you've given me. Whatever you've given me. Lord, here it is. Use it for your purposes, to build up your people. This is one type of life stance. The other life stance is it is all about me. And you're an abuser. And you're a tyrant. And you're always mad. And you're disappointed that everybody's not on board and worshiping at your feet, at the foot of thee. Humble yourself under the mighty hand of God. He'll restore your sanity. He'll bring you back to peace. And then he'll use you. And he'll fill you with purpose. In his purposes. What he's doing in this world. It's a win-win-win-win-win. To humble ourselves before God. There's nothing that you lose by humbling yourself before God. Letting him be the center of the universe, which he is, and you're not. It's called living in reality. Your mental health will tend to trend better when you live in reality. God's the eternal King. It's all about him. Use us, Lord. Use us, Lord, in your purposes. Help us keep our hands off, our grasping hands off. Help us stay out of the center. Lord, help us to realize everything you've given us, it's for your purposes. Lord, that you would use us for your glory. You'd use us in your purposes. We ask you to do this, Father, for your goodness and your glory and our greater joy. In Jesus' name we pray. And everybody who agreed said out loud together, blessings upon you, blessings upon you. Keep Israel in prayer, the peace of Jerusalem. Wow. See you next week.